Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and welcome to this special podcast with Islam 21C. It's been exactly a week since the last remaining European colony in the Middle East, Israel, launched a war against Iran, and they've been at it. They've been exchanging strikes. There've been casualties on both sides. The U.S.'s, Donald Trump's, the U.S.'s Supreme Leader Donald Trump has been weighing in and threatening to get involved in this fight as well. And we're very lucky to be joined by one of our community leaders, inshallah, Dr. Abdul Wahid. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Salman, and brothers and sisters watching.
How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah, always. How can we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala enough for what we have? Especially when we see what other people are facing in the world today, whether it's in Gaza, the West Bank, Tehran, Yemen, Syria, all these places where people are living under either bombardment, potential bombardment, sniper fire, starvation. We can only thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for what we have.
Alhamdulillah. So, like I mentioned, it's been a week exactly now since this war was started by the Zionist colony. How I guess my first question is, how should Muslims interpret and see through the headlines that they're being shown, predominantly from the quote-unquote mainstream media?
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. It's a good question, because if you ever experienced the fog of war, if you never experienced the fog of war before, then you certainly experienced it in the last week. We've become quite used to being skeptical about mainstream news channels, whether it's BBC, Sky, CNN, because of the biased reporting they carry. I think what I've learned in the last week really is you really need to second check stuff that you see on social media. I've seen quite a few posts where I was thinking about sharing them and then double checked and then found they're actually not right. They're wrong. Images of targets that have been bombed when they actually haven't been bombed. They're old archive footage or from other theaters of conflict. I saw an article today talking about the Israeli stock market and how it had plummeted. Not an article, a post on X, how it had plummeted. And if you do a quick Google search, you'll see articles saying it's never been so good. So, really, I think we need to be quite discerning and recognize that what we're in at the moment is either a narrative portrayed by Western media, which is trying to achieve a certain concept in its audience, a certain opinion in its audience. And I think when you watch BBC, you can see a narrative which is generally anti-Iran, but actually also quite skeptical and critical of the Israeli government. And then also trying to bring out softer voices in both societies to say, an Iranian voice that says they're against the regime and the government there, and an Israeli voice that says, we're not against all Iranians. We're nice people, really, and we should recognize that these big media channels are trying to manipulate us as an audience. I think the riskier thing for most Muslims who have shifted away from those sources of information is to understand that you can't even trust what you see on social media. So we need to be very discerning and think carefully about what's happening and be critical about what we see and what we read, I think.
Do you think there's a tide change happening in the British establishment? Because when it comes to the BBC, everyone's, it's no surprise to say, it's biased or whatever. But one retired executive actually said it to our faces once. We did this kind of media training once, and he said for domestic news coverage and stuff, we have generally a degree of independence, but when it comes to international affairs we basically have to follow the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the line that the Foreign Office gives. But to see now it seems the tide shifting, and they're kind of trying to make Netanyahu or this quote unquote Israeli government the fall guys or the scapegoats almost. Does it seem like there's a narrative shift happening? Maybe they're trying to throw Netanyahu under the bus to save the Zionist colony project.
That's what it feels like. I mean, Britain excels in soft power because it doesn't have much hard power left, and the BBC is one very important tool in its armory of soft power, and the World Service in particular, and the World BBC World TV, and the opinion. It's got a brand which it tries to exploit globally, and it very much takes its lead from what British foreign policy is. And I agree with you entirely. I think the so-called criticisms of the Zionist occupation of Palestine have been focused on certain political leaders and certain political parties and this government, as opposed to the fact that 80% of the people in the Zionist entity think that what's going on in Gaza is acceptable, that's what their government is doing, what their regime is doing there is acceptable, and I think that shows you they are trying to save their colony, and even if that means throwing their current leaders under a bus, to try and portray it as something that is particular to these leaders.
It seems that their proxy is getting a bit too loose cannony. But do you see
Salman, there's always been a tension right from the word go, right from pre-1948. Zionists were of two types. There was the pragmatic type that realized they're not very strong. They're entirely dependent on the colonial powers, initially Britain and later the United States. And recognizing that they were dependent on them, part of their narrative was, part of their appeal to them was, we can be a force for you, we can be a colony for you. You be our daddy and we'll be your kids, and we'll be trained and do what you say. That's one faction which has got weaker over the decades. It's a very small faction within the political leadership of the Zionist entity at the moment that has that view. That the original, what they call the revisionist Zionists, they were much more, no, we want our own state, to be empowered for ourselves. If we have a relationship with these colonial powers, we'll only do as much as we have to, but we have our own interests, we have our own objectives, and that force has become ever more dominant. And where you see people talking about clashes between, say, Biden and Netanyahu, or Trump and Netanyahu, you see that slight, what you say, conflict of interest or divergence of interests. But there are many reasons why the Zionist entity really gets away with murder. It gets away with murder, even when it's doing something which is what the Americans might say is not their preferred option. And I think this latest thing with Iran is a good example. Literally, how can it be that Trump comes into office, he puts out feelers to the Iranians through Oman to say that we'll start a round of negotiations on nuclear power and not having a nuclear weapon, and this negotiating teams are meeting and discussing, and it's all going to a certain timetable and agenda. It's not easy, it's tense, but it's happening. And then on the brink of that, you suddenly find that somebody's killing the negotiators. There's questions. The Americans said, well, that wasn't us, we didn't have anything to do with it. And the Israelis say, well, no, we kept the Americans informed about everything we were doing. And reading between the lines, you can almost see that Trump, as a hard negotiator, would like the idea of somebody using some force, maybe to bring the Iranians closer to what Trump wants from them. And also see about the Israelis taking the opportunity that they weren't absolutely prohibited from doing that by Trump, in just smashing as much as they could, because they want to take advantage of Iran's relative weakness at the moment. And you can really see how the games that are being played, and in the end, it's people's lives that are being ruined. People's lives in Tehran. It's Gaza. It's Gaza. The spotlight has gone off Gaza for so many days. Last week there was an internet blackout there, and in the aftermath, we were hearing about 100 killed this day, 90 killed that day.
Aid massacres.
That's right. The aid massacres. It's literally happening, and our gaze has gone away, understandably, to something else. But this war serves many objectives for the Israelis, and not one of them is that they can continue their ethnic cleansing, not just of Gaza, the West Bank has accelerated as well. So, and this is another thing. When you say, how should Muslims read through the current headlines? Well, we should be, when we're critical thinkers about things, we shouldn't, it's not just that we should be skeptical about what the BBC or CNN or our Twitter feeds are saying. We should be hypercritical of that. Are we being fed to look in a certain direction so that we're actually looking away from another direction? That's a level of self discipline that we need to have, that we're not just dragged along by everyone else to where we should be looking and what we should be looking at.
So do you think Trump is maybe upset or annoyed with the Zionists, or do you think, how have you been reading this situation?
I haven't seen any evidence that he's.
I mean, we saw them.
Seen any evidence. Have you seen any evidence that he's upset or annoyed? I mean, it's like, literally, you can't. He can't seem to do enough to please them. And I think the criticisms within America, even from the MAGA movement, is that, is it about Make America Great, or is it about making Israel great? I really do think he has brought himself into a position where he's getting criticism from his own supporters on that.
Well, we've certainly seen a lot of people, right wingers, kind of that were previous supporters of Trump, maybe even current supporters, really, hitting out at the Zionists for trying to drag America into what we've seen Benjamin Netanyahu go on, right-wing news channel after news channel, kind of cap in hand, almost begging the US to kind of get involved. And do you think Trump is leading the US into another forever war? Because one interpretation is, the global economy, the Western military industrial complex, oil prices, oil and gas, they need war to just kind of continue profits, continue, the machine, the war machine kind of turning. Do you think Donald Trump's going to give them that?
He's certainly in danger of that. I think he basically, Trump's rhetoric and his past actions do suggest a preference for economic pressure, using trade, and maybe just targeted strikes over these prolonged ground wars that his predecessors got themselves into. He's pretty much given an unconditional support to the Zionist entity, and they are trying to drag him into a war. He's got some very hawkish advisors. He's got neocons in Congress. He's got the same lobby that was for the war on terror and the war in Iraq, using the same narrative of weapons of mass destruction and regime change and all these kind of things, who are talking to him on one side. and he has his MAGA support base and those people on the other side. And that tension has been going on in US politics for a long time anyway. And Trump is in the middle of that. And he's a volatile character, isn't he? There's no evidence that the guy has a very set, fixed, strategic way of thinking. It's much more impulsive.
I think he's projecting that as well, to use that to his advantage, to keep his, interlocutors guessing in negotiation and stuff.
100%. I think that's a style that he uses, which you're right is very effective. But I from everything you read about him, and even people that have worked closely with him and respect him, that is his nature as well. Just as in business, when he has an instinct for something and he decides he's going to do it, and he moves and he does it, and he mobilizes all his resources to achieve that objective. This is how he's approached many things in policy, including foreign policy. So he's hearing things from all different people, and he hasn't, when he says he hasn't made up his mind whether to join the attacks on Iran, he might be telling the truth, but it might not take much for him to hear an argument one way or the other, which, according to one of his former policy advisors, who was on the media yesterday, saying literally he can make up his mind and then he'll stick with that. So we really don't know which way he'll go. Now, is he likely to go into a forever war? He won't think he is. He will think that, okay, I will use these massive US bunker busting bombs dropped by B-52s to strike the heart of the Iranian centrifuges, which are buried deep in the mountainside, which the Israelis can't get to. That might be what he's thinking. But Iran doesn't have many options, and if it really did do what matched up to its rhetoric, it would be looking at all the US interests in the region, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Iraq, and it would be looking to mobilize its proxies in the region to damage those US interests. It would be looking to cause problems in the traffic in the Straits of Hormuz or in the Red Sea, with the Houthis using them like to make interruptions in the Red Sea, which affects global trade and will affect the United States. So I think a lot of these, he might think he's going to strike a targeted strike, but those who are cautious out there are worried that this could go a direction.
So a lot of the pretext for these strikes and this attack against Iran has been nuclear weapons. Now, me personally, I'm against nukes and WMDs in principle, but it's hard to see the fact that only those countries that don't have nukes and nuclear weapons seem to be the ones that keep getting invaded and occupied by kind of belligerent Western-backed regimes. What do you think about Muslim nations, Muslim states, kind of and nuclear weapons?
I think if they'd never been invented, we would not have had a justification to try and invent them. Now they exist, and those big powers in the world who are responsible for so much harm to Muslims and others around the world, the United States, Britain, Europe, China, Russia, all have these nuclear weapons. It is hard to justify why we don't have deterrence, why we don't have nuclear deterrence, really, because truthfully, the reason that any of us want these would be to deter others. And these countries think twice when they have to face a country that has a nuclear deterrent. And I think we as Muslim countries need to have these. It's as simple as that. I mean, if Iran had any doubt before as to whether it needed a nuclear deterrent or not, that doubt should be abolished by now. Iran has been seeking civilian nuclear power since the late 70s. in the Shah's time. And it actually reached out to Europe initially and the US, and there were talks about it. And then after the Islamic Revolution, that all went quiet for a few years. And then there was some talk about it resuming. And it was kind of on a back burner, but it was never really something that was progressed. And then you get the rhetoric from the Israelis, from Netanyahu, particularly not just Netanyahu, Shimon Peres before him in the early 90s, and then Netanyahu in the mid 90s, arguing that Iran is just like, weeks away, months away from getting a nuclear weapon, all that crying wolf that they did then. And that then transferred into a lobby in the United States, which was trying to convince factions within the US that they need to oppose that, which they did. And you got with the George W. Bush era, all that rhetoric against Iran and axis of evil and that sort of thing. So Iran, now since the Obama time, there has been a policy that Iran could have civil nuclear energy, and as recently as March this year, the US National Intelligence Director, Tulsi Gabbard, she said that there's no evidence that Iran has a nuclear weapon or nuclear weapon program. That was like literally, it was and yet that's just ignored. That is just ignored. Trump was actually asked that question when he was on Air Force One leaving the G7 conference. And, he said, he was actually asked, he said, but your own national intelligence director says that there's no evidence. He says, well, I think she's wrong. And I saw that and I thought to myself, well, what is the point of having an intelligence director if you think your gut instinct tells you she's wrong? She's not saying...
As long as he doesn't say God told him otherwise.
Yeah, but it's nonsense. It's how can you make policy like this? The point is that there isn't that there. I think an objective observer would say there is no evidence that Iran has a weapon or has actually even got to the point that it's trying to make a weapon. What there is evidence of is they have enriched uranium well beyond the necessity of what's needed for civil nuclear power. So if you need up to 30% or something for civil nuclear power enrichment and 90% for a weapon, Iran is somewhere between 60 to 80% at the moment.
Yeah.
So the skeptics and the hawks would say, well, why? But and the more conservative people that are looking at actual evidence will say, well, there's a lot of stages in between this enrichment and actually weaponizing.
Yeah, I mean,
which we've seen no evidence of yet.
That's the kind of point of that's the point of rules, all right. I was listening to this today as well on the news that they've enriched to 60%, which is what is allowed under the non-proliferation treaty.
Yeah,
and I thought, what's the point of having rules and international norms and so-called laws if you follow the rules, you get attacked? And if you flaunt the rules, like the Zionist entity has been, nothing happens. Are people getting to a point where, or have they passed a point where there just are no rules? This is just some pageantry.
Well, I hope they have got to the point of that, because the rules were made to control the weak. The rules were never that. There was no international law before the UN, or even you could argue, even in the era of the League of Nations, maybe there was some form of international law. But historically, before that, there wasn't an international law which the powerful made and everybody else was bound by. Rather, there were international norms of how people did trade, how people made treaties, how people did war and made peace. And these were international norms which people stuck to. And where you had bilateral treaties or multilateral treaties, states, including in the Islamic world, would be signed up to those. But what has happened in the 20th century is this idea of, let's have an international law, which we as the powerful nations in the world make, and we hold others to that standard, but actually they never held themselves to that standard. So you look at, whether you look at war crimes in Afghanistan or Iraq, whether you look at the behavior of the Zionist entity over decades, the fact that it violates UN resolution after resolution, whether you look at the last 18, 19 months of what it's done in Gaza, where it's been accused of genocide and still their leaders are hosted and wined and dined in Western capitals. So I hope we have learned that this law was not made to make the world a better and fairer place. This law was made to bind the weaker nations to something, a standard which the powerful nations have always felt they've had a license to break. Karim Khan, the prosecutor at the ICJ, he said he was when he
ICC,
first
yeah.
proposed ICC. Sorry, he proposed this sanctions on or a warrant, issued warrants for Netanyahu and others. He said a leading Western politician phoned him up and said, "What are you doing? These laws are not for white people. They're for the brown people. Literally, they're not for Europe, America, Canada, Australia, and the Zionist entity. They are for." He doesn't literally mean brown and white, because they are for Putin. They are for, they happily will apply them to somebody like Putin, but they applied them to Milosevic when he no longer suited their purpose, and they will apply them to Muslims, to Iran, to Palestinians, to Sudan. They'll apply them to African rulers, but in their own mind, these rules are not to be adhered to by themselves or their proxies. So I really sincerely hope that we have learned a lesson, which is that these laws are there to constrain and bind the rest of the world and keep them weak and subservient. And in fact, we
Do you
have
think the
our
answer
own.
is to?
We have Islam has its own international law. This is a very important point. Even those Muslims that talk about, we should have an international law. Well, did you not know that there were Sharia books, rules written about the law of relationships between the Islamic governance, the Khilafah, and the rest of the other states in the world? Imam Shaybani, may Allah have mercy on him, wrote a book, Kitab al-Siyar. So in that, you literally see clause after clause, paragraph after paragraph, giving the evidence of relationships between Islamic governments and other governments in the world in terms of all kinds of things, whether it's war, peace, water treaties, land treaties, all these kind of things. It's all mentioned there. So if we say that we accept international law as it's supposed to be, even if it was a fair deal for everyone, which it's never been, if we say that, effectively we're saying that aspect of Sharia, we are pushing that away, and we are accepting the laws of the Security Council instead. And that should feel problematic for us as Muslims.
Yeah, I remember a few brothers who studied law and specialized in international law. They said international law and international relations, one of the core textbooks historically is, in the field in general, is Kitab al-Siyar by Imam Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, rahimahullah. But the problem is, they also said, our lecturers said, international law, it's just a really good idea, but it's not really a thing, because it comes down to who's going to actually enforce it. There's no world police.
Yes.
It's just to it's just whoever has the biggest guns, whoever has the most scary proclivity to violence, and there's only been one type of people bereft of any morality enough to actually use these types of weapons. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, something like 6 or 7 Hiroshimas worth of ordnances have already been, dumped on Gaza, a small strip the size of East London. So it's in practice, it requires power and it requires force. So are you suggesting that the weaker nations need to basically get stronger? Or, is it possible to just throw this whole thing out and build something from scratch?
Well, in practice, international, as you say, international law requires force. It requires enforcement. And in the model that exists in the world today, it's the Security Council that is the enforcer. And the Security Council, which has its 5 permanent members, who are some of the biggest international criminals the world has ever seen in its entire history, have a right of veto. So if ever enforcing that international law conflicts with them directly or their interests around the world, then you will never see the enforcement of that. That's an unfair law. Rather, we want to get to a stage in the world where people accept that this law is bogus, and either you enforce it, and if you're not going to enforce it after a genocide in Gaza, you're never going to enforce it. And there are sincere people, by the way, there are sincere people out there in the West, lawyers, academics, some politicians, who genuinely believe in these institutions and would be desperate to see these people brought to justice, as they should be according to the international law, and in order to uphold that international law. But if you're being realistic, that's just not going to happen. It's just never going to happen, because they've already effectively said they're not going to allow that, unless you see these very few prosecutions of individuals to save the whole project. So you might see one day a new regime in
Scapegoats.
Tel Aviv, and a few of these guys sanctioned. The only way that this international law ever gets used is to scapegoat individuals, like it did for Milosevic, for example. But I can't see Netanyahu ever being in the dock. Can you imagine him being in a court in the dock where he's allowed to say what he said to Trump, what he said to Biden, what he said to Clinton, what they said to him? I don't believe that will ever happen. We'll never see a day where that happens. So
might mysteriously die in prison, like Jeffrey Epstein, or
that's the kind of scenario that happens to these people, rather than letting them speak out. But in the end, we want a situation where the Muslim world is powerful, but not power that is in the hands of people like MBS or any of these criminals. Because power, when people say power comes with responsibility, power comes with accountability. And we have 2 levels of accountability Islamically, politically. Our leaders should be accountable to the Ummah, but also they must believe they're accountable to Allah. And in fact, anyone with any power in the world that doesn't believe they're accountable to Allah is an unrestrained power. No amount of international law and international court will restrain that kind of person. You have to be a person that has a taqwa of Allah, or a person or a government or a state that has that taqwa of Allah to behave with the power that Allah has given you. In the Quran, when Allah talks about the likes of Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran, it's a message to us that, like, rulers have to have power and accountability before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it's not just about the Muslim world having power, it's about that power being coupled with Islam and the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions it clearly, very simple words. Kalla innal insana la yatgha ar-ra'ahu istaghna. Indeed, the human being, it's in his nature, he will transgress as soon as he feels that he has no one above him. He is self-sufficient. He has no one to hold him to account. So it's like a fundamental feature in us, and it makes sense that just like an individual, likewise a nation or some kind of entity, some kind of organization, if it doesn't feel it has someone or something above it holding it to account, it's unrestricted, it's untethered. And that's how you see, genocides happen. That's how you see Holocausts happen. That's how you see, nuclear bombs being dropped. But so, what is your message then to the policymakers of?
The famous incident in the time of Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab, isn't there, where the Muslims, they opened a new land without giving an invitation to those people to either embrace Islam or pay jizya, and somebody accounted on that you are supposed, isn't it in your deen that you are supposed to give this invitation first? And Sayyidina Umar, he said yes, and he withdrew the troops. I mean, this is like unheard of this is the kind of thing that you can imagine if a ruler did it today. All his advisors are saying, "Are you crazy? We just occupied this area of land, and you're telling you've got to, we lost soldiers doing this, we lost troops doing this, we expended effort and money doing this, and you're telling us we have to withdraw?" Yeah. And the answer to that is yeah. We're telling you that you have to withdraw because this is not about, we don't engage in the world for the sake of material gain. We don't engage in the world for that. We engage in the world for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the rules are His, and the duty is on us to obey them.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. I just need a few seconds of your time to tell you about our new campaigns that require your attention. Become one of 1,000 guardians who will defend the Ummah, safeguard minds, strengthen faith, and uphold the truth through our new transformative campaigns. Number 1, Palestine Truth. Exposing lies, amplifying Palestine voices, and countering false Zionist narratives. Number 2, Guarding Innocence. Countering godless ideologies, ensuring our children grow up proud of their faith, values, and identity. Number 3, Power of a Muslim Woman, opposing individualism, avid materialism, and social decay by showcasing our homemakers and mothers as the true builders of civilization. And number 4, Hold On, saving lives by providing support for those battling hopelessness and suicidal thoughts. For just £10 a month, you will be part of a mission that aims to impact 500 million lives, inshallah. Do not miss out on the huge reward. Click the link in the description below and donate.
So what's your message then to the Muslim state leaders, the policymakers, not just like the ceremonial kind of puppets or whatever, but the people that have power people that have potential influence? What's your message there? Because things could change so quickly. The Khilafah was abolished in a very short period of time, many times in history, and it was reestablished. And obviously that's one of your things. But in terms of one of your things that you're known for talking about and advocating for, as many Muslims are. But practically speaking, imagine if some policymaker and some influential person in Egypt or Sudan or Pakistan, whatever, is listening. What's your message to them?
My message to them, and when I say this, there'll be a bunch of people out there who will say they're all corrupt. They're all these power brokers, these politicians, these leaders, the people behind them, the military leaders behind them, they're all corrupt. And I fundamentally disagree with this premise that every single person is always corrupt. Because you then don't have any space to say that there's any hope that anyone can make tawbah and change. And our history in Islam, and actually, whether it's going back to the time of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, or even more recently than that, it does show that people do have a capacity to change. So, the fact that the worst enemies of Islam in the time of the Prophet ﷺ ended up embracing Islam and becoming the greatest amongst the Sahaba is a testament to that. And so if you judge people as they are at their worst, you will negate the fact that any words, any actions, any sensation that person has about what's happening in the world, it's going to have any effect. And I just don't believe that. The second thing I'd say is it only takes one or two or a few to hear the words or to see something that's happening in the world to start a change in somebody's heart. So I don't think it's foolish to talk like this when you say, what's your message to these people? My message to these people is that, have you not seen, have you not learned what's happened in the world under the watch of these Western powers? And when you look at Gaza, you see the worst of it. And when you look at Iran, or when you look at Ukraine, look at those people that cooperated and relied and had faith on international institutions that they were going to be fair, or on global powers that they had their back, and then they get betrayed. Ukraine felt that America had its back, and it's been thrown under a bus. Iran, if you look at its actions in the last few months, it restrained itself from doing what any other independent state would have done, which would have been to respond robustly to some of the attacks that came on it. It restrained itself. Why? Because it believed that Trump, with his negotiation, or the Americans or the Europeans, that somebody was going to invite them back in. The fact that they had a rapprochement with the Saudis didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of an olive branch that comes. It's not like, the Saudis don't do that just because they want to have a rapprochement with Iran. There's some wider agenda for the Middle East that's going on. And Iran, whether it's trusted Russia in the past or whether it's trusted America through the intermediaries and stuff, it has, if you like, trusted the international order that it would be fair. And it's learning in a very hard way that it's absolutely unfair. And it was always going to be like that. So when these leaders are watching, do you not learn from that? And do you not fear
You could be
Allah when you
next.
see you will be next? You will be next. Even Netanyahu made his speech, didn't he, where he was talking about Iran and Pakistan, he said. And if Israel gets its greater Israel, which includes part of Lebanon and part of Syria and part of Egypt, do you think it's going to stop at that if it sees any other regional power that is strong enough to rival it? After you see what it's done to Iran, it has been speculating on the fact that Iran could be a potential threat for over 30 years when it absolutely had no evidence of that. It's manufactured a consent for an attack on Iran in Western capitals. Do you think that will not happen on Egypt, on Turkey, on Jordan someday? I'm sorry. This is an entity that is acting, that is still bombing in Syria, that is still bombing in Lebanon, that is still with impunity, and it launches a unilateral act of war on Iran with impunity, and you think you're safe? Well, if you're afraid of that, you should fear Allah more, and know that unless the Muslim world changes and re-embraces Islam, and re-embraces the Khilafah, re-embraces the justice of Islam, and harnesses the many, many resources we have, this is not going to end at Iran. I can tell you that. If they get their way in Iran, this is not going to end in Iran. Wake up, everyone. That is what you should be looking at. That's what you should be thinking about. And I don't say you should look at this from a purely interest base. It should make you think, and that thinking should lead you to think that this is happening because we went away from the rule of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We went away from his guidance. And that is purely and simply by doing that, we have allowed the world to get to the state it has.
Allah says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. Whoever turns away from my guidance, my reminder, he'll have a miserable life. And it follows that if it's states, if it's countries, if it's the globe, it could happen likewise.
And he says, وَالَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ بَعْضٍ. The disbelievers, they're allies of one another. إِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا تَكُنْ فِتْنَةٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَفَسَادٌ كَبِيرٌ. And if you Muslims don't ally with one another, become unified, then there'll be a fitna on the earth and a great fasad, great corruption on the earth. It's not a great corruption which is limited to the Muslim world. It's a corrupt earth. It's a corrupt earth that you're looking at. And that's exactly the consequences of our lack of unity under Islam, is the chaos in the world that we're seeing today.
So that actually might be a good segue to another thing the brothers and sisters want me to ask you, actually. There's obviously the sectarian angle as well here. So, Iran, it's historically presented itself as a supporter of Palestinians, but at the same time, it's had its hand in many massacres and countless Gazas in just Syria alone, not to mention other countries in the Middle East and beyond. How do you think we should navigate this? Because obviously nobody wants to support the Zionist entity against against Iran, but you want to be wary of not doing the opposite and just kind of ignoring people with blood on their hands and whitewashing some of their, like Assadis and stuff. They feel they've bought into this axis of resistance and nobility and honor and stuff like that. Do you think, firstly, how do you see this? Is Iran is it its policies sincere when it comes to the removal of dhulm against the Palestinians, or is it looking at its own interests and its own image? And secondly, do you think so? It has offered like a call to its what they're calling our fellow Muslim brothers and sisters, in terms of the Arab regimes and stuff in the neighborhood. Do you think this is going to lead, and could this lead to a more close cooperation and a rapprochement with Muslim states and Iran?
So I think I look at I think it's more helpful to look in this in terms of nation states in the region than through the sectarian lens. And I'll tell you why. For many reasons, the sectarian argument, there are exceptions to that rule, which you could bring. Iran doesn't have a great relationship with Azerbaijan, which is a neighboring state where most of the people are Shia. Okay, so like, and actually has a quite hostile relationship with them in many ways. So, and it didn't intervene. In fact, in the historic conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, sometimes Iran has taken the Armenian side. So the sectarian thing it exists amongst some people without question, but it's more helpful to look at this in terms of the issue of nation states. And Iran it believes in itself as a nation. It's one of the reasons I don't think of it as an Islamic state. It believes in itself as a nation. If Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was alive today, he doesn't fulfill the criteria of the Iranian constitution to be the leader of Iran. So, it's a very nationalistic state. And in fact, when you look at its relations with other states, there has been in 2023, I think, the start of a rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, and
brokered by
what's
China.
The basis of that? That's not. Sorry,
I think it was brokered by China.
It was China was the party that was out to arbitrate between them. But the point is, both parties were open to that discussion and that dialogue, and they were both willing to go down that road. So I can't say what will happen in the future. These big Gulf states would be very happy if Iran was cut down to size, right? Because they genuinely feel threatened by a powerful Iran, in the same way that Iran would feel threatened by powerful neighbors, which would potentially be more powerful economically and militarily than itself. Why? Because that's the way that nation states are. That is, in the end, all nation states, wherever they are in Europe. You look at the politics in Europe. It's in their DNA in Europe. They're all allies, aren't they? Except when one of them gets more powerful than the other. Nobody wants to see Germany the most powerful country in Europe. Why? Because whenever it was, they tried to gang up against Germany to stop them. And similarly, any country, it's the identity of nation states. They will think of themselves as stronger, and they will try and stretch their reach and do it in a way that benefits themselves. If you look at things through that lens, then there isn't much noble about the axis of resistance for the sake of Palestine. In fact, we haven't actually seen Iran strike Israel for the sake of Gaza. The two times when Iran has launched missiles, in the last week, and previously, was it October last year, when Israel struck Iran, and then Iran sent their drones and then some missiles after that, was over in about 24, 48 hours. They were both when Iran itself had been struck. They were not going to get involved when And this whole idea that they're absolutely anti-imperialist. I mean, you know, America was really struggling in Iraq post 2003. And yeah, you can argue that Iran using some of their proxies made things harder for America. But you know what? In the end, they really didn't put the boot in when they could have done. They could really have damaged the US in Iraq and the US interests in Iraq. If it was a truly independent state, it effectively could have taken over sections of Iraq and expelled all American troops, and it never did that. So, you know, you have to see that they've tried to play both sides on these things for a long time.
And they've tried
When
to
it
follow
comes
the
to
rules.
Yeah, they have.
It's,
And
you know,
so going back to your point. Going back to your point. Whatever the situation is now, right? I deal with now. I can't forget what's happened in the past and what they've done in the past. And even if now they're in a moral right, and we say that and we affirm that, and they have a right to defend themselves, and the people of Iran, the Muslims in Iran, do not deserve to be bombed like this and expelled from their home. And this WMD idea, this idea of nuclear, it's a bogus, it's a fabrication. And there's an injustice in the world that, you know, how come Iran should have said, you destroy all your nuclear weapons, America, and then tell us that we shouldn't develop one ourselves. Because that's the right thing. That's the just thing for everyone. You should expose all of that. All of those things we can say. And none of that takes away from the crimes of their government before and what they've done in Syria and elsewhere. And none of those things would be a license for any future government to do anything. I often think, what if we were talking about a different state? What if Israel were attacking Turkey? What if Israel was attacking Saudi Arabia? What if Israel was attacking Egypt? All the regimes in these countries have crime that they have to answer for, blood on their hands, you know. Does that suddenly mean that we're going to be like bringing all of that stuff up at a time when the biggest criminal in the Middle East is committing a genocide, and, you know, and they've now done an unprovoked invasion of another country in the region, and they're trying to drag the Americans into that, and they're fabricating lies about it, and they're increasing their rhetoric about Islam in the world, all the Islamophobia that they fuel. They're talking about Pakistan being a dangerous state. Are we really going to accept that and just sit on the sides and be silent? I don't think that's an option for us, Salman. And I think it helps to see these things through the lens of what's happening in geopolitics. Yeah, there is a sectarian angle to it. There's no doubt about that. But the sectarian thing doesn't answer every question about the behavior of these states.
Where do you see this war ending? What are the possible end games now? So it's been a week now, over a week now. Many people thought it was just going to be like the usual managed escalation, tit for tat, but it does seem to be escalating. Where are the off ramps?
Yeah, isn't it difficult to know, really, isn't it? It could still be a tit for tat if somebody manages to rein both sides in quickly. If Iran does agree to go back to the negotiating table, if Israel is reined in by America, then it could settle down. America could get dragged in. They could bomb the deep mined Iranian reactors and centrifuges, and it could end up facing an asymmetric response from Iran, which could destabilize the whole region more and more. Allah only knows best. I mean, you know, in the midst of all of this, you have China sitting on the sidelines, where America's attention would love
rubbing
to be
its
over
hands
in the Far East. yeah, China will be watching this and with interest, because really America, since the time of Obama, they've wanted to pivot away from the Middle East uh, to and from Europe towards China, and they keep getting dragged back in. And I think this is Trump's biggest potential error here if he lets himself get dragged back in. And there are some very vulnerable Western assets in Israel as well. If Iran really was trying to damage the West, all those data centers that Microsoft and Amazon and have in Israel, or Intel's manufacturing capability there, these are targets which data. You think of those data centers as like the oil of today. That has big economic impacts on it, which has ramifications elsewhere in the world. So you have China watching this with interest, and we have no idea which way this is going to go, really. And in that, you mentioned the thing that the world changes quickly, and in the past, Islamic governance has been re-established after periods of absence. Sometimes these things happen quickly. Things do happen quickly. None of us expected a change in Syria at the speed that it happened. Okay, now, things can happen quickly, and we need to remember that. The Khilafah was destroyed in 1924. The period that led to its destructions was I mean, you can argue how long. Okay, you can go back decades and decades and look at weaknesses, but the last 10 years, from World War One, from 1914 through to 1917, which weakened the Khilafah, but then Jerusalem was lost in 1917. Baghdad and Damascus were lost in 1917. And ultimately, the war was lost in 1918, which led to a peace process which carved up the Middle East. And in 1924, the Khilafah was formally abolished by Mustafa Kemal. That process happened in over 10 years. And that change happened when there was a big geopolitical shakeup of the Middle East. You're seeing changes now, you're seeing events now that could lead to a similar geopolitical shakeup, right? And things can change quickly. When October 2023 happened, 7th of October 2023 happened, people in Egypt, ordinary people, politicians, actors, sportsmen were saying, why isn't the Egyptian army intervening? And public opinion was at a position at that stage where there's no way Sisi could have clamped down on them. Over 18 months, things have changed. The government has re-established some control there. It's pumped up the more nationalistic voices that mean even the march to Gaza that went there last week, or the convoy that's going there, even there are nationalistic voices which are criticizing that now. Public opinion is fickle in different directions, so it's not right for us to think that events are all bad and all going to end up in a mess. Wallahu ghalibun ala amrihi walakinna akthara an-nasi la ya'lamun. Allah has full control over his affairs, but most people don't know that. So as we watch things play out, and things often look very negative and look very unjust and look very out of our control, we can feel despondent. But we should realize a few things, that behind all this fog of war, there are a few things which really, I think, are worth noting. Israel has overwhelmingly more power, and particularly air power and missile power, than Iran. But when Iran's few missiles do reach their targets, it has a much greater emotional impact in the Zionist entity, who have got used to feeling invulnerable and got used to feeling that, when these tit for tats happen, they're never really going to see any real damage. They're not used to having to rush off to bomb shelters every week. They're not used to their airport being closed for 5 days, 7 days. There's only a limited amount of time. The Haifa fuel depot, to rebuild that, you're talking significant costs to rebuild some of these things. And as I say, some of the targets that Iran could potentially hit, which would affect companies like Amazon or Microsoft or Intel, this would have a devastating impact to the Israeli economy, which reminds you just how vulnerable it is. And the other thing is that the Western media is trying to project this image of Israelis as being very robust and emotionally robust, and they're ready. I've been there. I don't know if you've been there. Anyone who's been there just knows this is just a lie. This is just a lie, right? They are really not an emotionally robust people. They're really not a brave people. They're soldiers. When you see them walking around the streets together, they only feel brave where there are 5 or 6 of them together with assault rifles. There's no concept of bravery in a way that is likely to endure any prolonged conflict. So I don't know where this is going to go, but none of us can see it through a negative lens. And even when we do see negativity, remember the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that Nasr comes, victory comes, help comes after hardship. And the test for us, this is really, I think, the main thing for you and me, Salman, the test for you and me and the Muslims who are watching is how we stay steadfast through all of this. What we should be doing. Are we just passive observers? Are we just watching from afar as other people make decisions in our name? Are we just sitting there watching our emotions being manipulated? Are we being distracted from the crisis in Gaza and the West Bank and Masjid al-Aqsa by being our thoughts being diverted onto other things, whether here or anywhere else in the world? And I think that is really what I think. Rather than thinking about the half a dozen different scenarios that could happen, why don't I think about what I should be doing now, what I can be doing now, what I should be talking about now, what I should be reminding people about now? That is far more important. How I should not let myself be silenced now. How speaking up for the Ummah, for Islam, for a revival, for a change in the world, for a better future for the world based on a change in the world is something we should be talking about. How, if we see, if a Khilafah was established next week, is it right that all of us should be slavishly obedient to the rulers like we are to the rulers in the Gulf today? Or should we be learning through this experience that actually Muslims need to enjoin ma'ruf and forbid munkar in every situation in their life? Because in the future, when we have good governance, it will only stay good if we enjoin ma'ruf and forbid munkar on the leadership. I don't expect that this ummah is going to inherit a good leadership if we aren't deserving of that. And part of that deserving of that is that in these troubled times, we have to speak and we have to act. We have to enjoin ma'ruf and forbid munkar. We have to be steadfast in these times, because that's the currency which will buy us Allah's help, if you think of it that way. That is our actions, our good deeds, our investing in talking about a change in the world for the sake of Islam, our calling for that change, our speaking up for Palestine, our speaking up against the actions of the Zionist entity in Iran. All of that counts.
Okay, so, I was actually going to ask you to wrap up, what's your message for the Muslims around the world right now? But you hit the nail on the head with that last piece of advice. We got to pull our socks up, us all individually, not just rely on, so-called leaders and people in power. I guess the only thing that remains is to thank you for joining us. You've given us a lot of time. We're going to quickly edit this and get this out ASAP, inshallah, because things are moving fast. So, Jazakumullah khaira, Ustad Dr. Abdul Wahid. And Jazakumullah khairan to you at home for watching. If you like this podcast, as usual, give it a like and a share, and subscribe to Islam 20 wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.